He had everything money could buy. But one moment with a hungry employee showed him he had nothing that mattered. This is the story that will make you think back on what really matters in this life. She was invisible. She was hungry. She was breaking inside. He was blind to her suffering. But one morning everything changed. And I need to tell you this story because it's about to change you too. Welcome to Voice of Granny. While you are here, please hit the subscribe button. Share with friends and comment where you're watching from. Thank you. Hello friends. Thank you so much for being here today. I want to share a story with you. A story that completely changed how I think about kindness, about wealth, and about what it really means to be rich. This is a true story about a man named James. And it's a story that I believe will touch your heart the way it touched mine. Let me take you back to a place. Picture, if you will, a beautiful city on the coast of California. Not too far from the ocean, but far enough that you can feel the peace of nature mixed with the energy of the city. In this place, there's a massive house. Not just any house, a mansion. This isn't the kind of mansion you see in movies with golden gates and a long driveway lined with fountains. No, this is something different. It's modern, it's clean, it's perfect. Almost too perfect if I'm being honest. This mansion belongs to a man named James Harrison. Now, James is what you might call a success story. He came from nothing, and I mean nothing. He grew up in a small apartment. His mother worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table, and his father left when James was just a boy. But James had something inside him. He had hunger, not just for food but for something more. For a better life, for respect, for control. James worked harder than anyone you've ever known. He woke up at 4 in the morning and didn't sleep until midnight. He went to college on scholarships, worked part-time jobs, and never complained. He climbed the ladder so fast that people could barely keep up with him. By the time he was 35 years old, James had built a business empire. He had investments everywhere: real estate, technology, finance. He made millions, then tens of millions, then hundreds of millions. Now you might think that with all this money James would be happy. You might think he'd be smiling all the time, surrounded by friends and family. But that's not what happened. You see, the same discipline that made James successful, the same cold precision that allowed him to make tough business decisions, that same thing had frozen his heart. He had learned to see the world in numbers, in profits and losses, in deals and contracts. He had forgotten something very important. He had forgotten how to feel. James lived in his mansion in the city, and he ran his life like he ran his business. Everything was timed. Everything was organized. Every person who worked for him had a specific job, and they did that job, and that was it. He didn't ask questions about their lives. He didn't care about their families or their dreams. Why would he? They were employees. They were part of the machine that kept his perfect life running. The mansion itself was like a museum. Beautiful, yes. Impressive, absolutely. But cold. The marble floors were always spotless. The paintings on the walls were expensive, but they didn't make you feel anything when you looked at them. The kitchen was the most advanced kitchen you could imagine. Stainless steel appliances, a huge island counter, windows that looked out onto a garden that was maintained by professional gardeners who came twice a week. Everything in that mansion reflected one thing: money and control. Everything except for one small corner behind the dining table, where something was about to change everything. James's typical day started early. He would wake up, usually from his bed in his master bedroom, and he would check his phone. Emails, messages, stock market updates, news about his competitors. His mind would immediately shift into work mode. He didn't have breakfast. He drank coffee, black, no sugar. He would spend 30 minutes on video calls with his teams, then another 30 minutes reviewing reports. By 8 in the morning, he had already made decisions that affected the lives of hundreds of people. But he didn't think about that. To him it was just business. On this particular morning, and this is the morning that matters, James was in the middle of a phone call with one of his business partners. They were discussing a deal, a big one, the kind of deal that would make even more money for James's already overflowing bank account. He was pacing around his bedroom, speaking quickly, using words like portfolio, return on investment, and market opportunity. His mind was sharp. His focus was intense. This was James in his element. But then something happened. Something small. Something that most people wouldn't even notice. James heard a sound from downstairs. It was faint, but it was there. The sound of a fork scraping against a plate. It wasn't loud enough to be anything important. It wasn't the sound of someone cleaning up after breakfast or preparing a meal. It was something quieter. Something hidden. James finished his call. He didn't say goodbye, he just hung up, because that's what James did when he was done with something, and he walked downstairs. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even particularly curious. He was just investigating. In James's mind, everything that happened in his house should be accounted for. Everything should make sense. And this sound didn't make sense. So he had to know what it was. As he walked down the stairs, his footsteps echoed on the marble. Each step was sure and confident. He walked into the kitchen, looked around, and didn't see anything out of place. So he followed the sound. It was coming from behind the counter. From the dining area. From a small corner where the morning light created a shadow. And then he stopped. His eyes found what he was looking for. And his world, for the first time in many years, paused. There, crouched in the corner where the shadow was darkest, was a young woman. Her name was Sophie. She was kneeling on the floor, her uniform, a simple black dress that James provided to all his household staff, was slightly wrinkled. Her hair was pulled back in a tight bun. Her eyes were looking down at the plate in her hands. And in that plate were leftovers from the dinner James had eaten the night before. Expensive food. Good food. Food that James hadn't finished and that would normally be thrown away. But Sophie wasn't throwing it away. She was eating it. Small bites. Hurried. Her hand was shaking just a little bit as she lifted the fork to her mouth. She ate like she was afraid. Like someone might catch her at any moment. Like she didn't deserve to eat this food in the first place. When James saw this, something happened inside him. I want to be honest with you about this moment because it's important. James didn't immediately feel compassion. He didn't immediately understand what he was looking at. His first thought was actually confusion. Why was his employee eating his leftovers? Why was she sitting on the floor? Why was she hiding? James stood there frozen. And Sophie, in that moment, was so focused on eating quickly, on getting as much food as she could before someone noticed her, that she didn't see him at all. She was a woman trying to survive. She was someone who was so hungry that she was willing to eat scraps off someone else's plate, sitting alone on a cold floor. James watched her for maybe 30 seconds, though it felt longer. He watched her eat. He watched her hands shake. He watched her look around, checking to make sure no one was watching. And in that moment something inside him broke. Not dramatically. Not with tears or big emotions. But something inside the wall that James had built around his heart cracked just a little bit. Without saying anything, without letting Sophie know he had seen her, James quietly turned around and walked back upstairs to his office. He needed to understand what he had just witnessed. Because in all his years of building his empire, in all his years of making money and making deals, James had never really looked at the people who worked for him. He had never really seen them. That afternoon, James did something he had never done before. He went through the household records. Not the financial records. He didn't care about money in this moment, and that's important. He went through the personal files, looking for information about Sophie. What he found was this. Sophie had been working for him for 9 months. She was 26 years old. She was from a small town in rural Mississippi. She came to the city with a dream of making a better life. In the space for emergency contact, it listed her mother and a younger brother. In the space for dependents, it listed both of them. That was all the information James had on file. Just facts. No story. No understanding of who this woman really was or what her life was actually like. James sat in his office, looking at these files, and he realized something that made him uncomfortable. He realized that he knew more about the specifications of his car than he knew about the people who worked in his house every single day. He knew the horsepower, the fuel efficiency, the color of the interior. But Sophie. He didn't even know what color her eyes were. He didn't know if she was happy or sad or struggling or content. She was just there. A piece of his organized world. That night James couldn't sleep. This is the truth. He lay in his bed in his expensive master bedroom, staring at the ceiling, and all he could think about was that moment. Sophie on the floor, her hands shaking. The look in her eyes that suggested she was used to eating this way. That this wasn't the first time she had hidden to eat her meal. James got out of bed. It was 3 a.m. He walked to his window and looked out at his garden. Everything was perfect. Everything was exactly as it should be. But something felt wrong. Something felt empty. He found himself thinking about his own past. The younger James. The version of himself that he had worked so hard to bury beneath success and money. James remembered what it was like to be hungry. Really hungry. Not just missing a meal, but going to bed with your stomach aching because there wasn't enough food. He remembered sharing a can of soup with his mother, both of them pretending it was filling when they knew it wasn't. He remembered feeling ashamed of having holes in his shoes. He remembered feeling like he didn't belong anywhere. He had worked his entire life to make sure he never felt that way again. And he had succeeded. He had built walls so high that he couldn't even see over them anymore. Somewhere along the way he had stopped being the person who knew what hunger felt like, and he had become the person who threw away food without thinking about it. The next morning James woke up early. Earlier than usual. He went downstairs to the kitchen before anyone else was awake. He wanted to watch. He wanted to understand. And then Sophie came in. She was wearing her uniform. Her face was very pale. There were dark circles under her eyes that James had never noticed before. She moved quietly through the kitchen, preparing breakfast for James and for the other staff members. She had this careful way of moving like she was trying to take up as little space as possible. Like she was trying not to bother anyone. When she accidentally dropped a spoon, just a regular accident, the kind of thing anyone might do, she flinched. She literally jumped like she had been hit. Her whole body went tight with fear. And then she looked around like she was checking to see if anyone had seen her drop the spoon. Like that small mistake was something shameful. That's when James really understood. This wasn't just about hunger. This was about fear. This was about someone who had learned to be invisible. Someone who had learned to make herself small and quiet so she wouldn't be a problem for anyone else. Over the next few days, James observed Sophie more carefully. He noticed that she was always the last to eat. She took the smallest portions from the staff meals. She often skipped breakfast completely, saying she wasn't hungry, even though James could see the way her eyes followed the food. She worked long hours. James realized she had never asked for a day off in 9 months. She was always there, always working, always trying to do everything perfectly. Then James did something that surprised even himself. He asked the head housekeeper, Margaret, about Sophie. Margaret was an older woman who had worked for James for 5 years. She was one of the few people in the house who James actually respected, because she did her job and didn't complain. James asked her very simply, "Where does Sophie send her money?" Margaret looked at him like she was trying to figure out why he was asking. Then she told him. Sophie sent almost all of her paycheck home to her mother and her brother. Almost all of it. She kept just enough to pay for a small room in a shared apartment and to buy the cheapest food she could find. The reason she had been eating leftovers wasn't because she was lazy or ungrateful. It was because she was trying to save money. She was sacrificing her own comfort, her own meals, so that her family could survive. James felt his heart break. And I mean that literally. He felt his chest tighten. He felt something crack inside him that he didn't even know was still there. That afternoon, James did something he rarely did. He left his office. He left his mansion. He went to his favorite restaurant, an expensive place where he usually went to conduct business meetings. He ordered his usual meal, an expensive steak, a glass of wine, all the things that he enjoyed because he had earned the right to enjoy them. But when he took his first bite, something was wrong. The food tasted like ash in his mouth. Every bite reminded him of Sophie eating leftovers on the cold floor. The expensive steak, which he had always savored, suddenly felt like proof of something he didn't want to admit. That while he was eating like a king, one of the people in his own house was going hungry. James pushed the plate away. He left money on the table, more than enough the way he always did, and he walked out of the restaurant. He walked through the city streets, and for the first time in years, he really looked at the people around him. He saw a homeless man on a corner. He saw a mother with 2 children asking for spare change. He saw all the people that he had trained himself not to see. People who were struggling. People who were hungry. And he realized something. Sophie was one of these people. Sophie was working a job, was doing everything right, was following all the rules, and she was still going hungry. If that could happen to Sophie, it could happen to anyone. That evening, James sat in his office with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. He was thinking about everything. About how he had grown up poor. About how his mother had worked 2 jobs. About how he had promised himself that he would never be poor again, and he had kept that promise. But in keeping that promise, he had built a prison around his own heart. He thought about what his mother would say if she could see him now. His mother, who had given up everything for him, who had taught him the meaning of hard work and sacrifice. What would she think of him living in this mansion, eating expensive food, and allowing someone like Sophie to hide on the floor to eat scraps? The next morning, James did something that changed everything. He called a meeting. All of his household staff came to the dining room. There were maybe 15 people, cleaners, gardeners, cooks, maintenance workers. They stood around the room, wondering why they had been called together. James rarely spoke to them as a group. He usually communicated through Margaret, the head housekeeper. James looked at all of them, and he said something that would have surprised anyone who knew him. "I want to apologize to you. I want to apologize for treating you like you are less than me. I want to apologize for not seeing you as people, as humans with lives and families and dreams. I want to apologize for creating a system in this house that separates us, that puts me above you and you below me." There was silence. Complete silence. No one knew what to say. Then James continued. "From today forward, things are going to change in this house. From today forward, everyone who works here will eat together in this dining room. Everyone. No separation. No leftovers. No shame. You will eat at the same table as me. You will eat the same food as me. Because you deserve respect. Because you deserve dignity." When James said this, he looked directly at Sophie. And Sophie's eyes filled with tears. She tried to look away, but James saw. He saw that she understood exactly what he was saying. He was saying that she was worthy, that she mattered. After the meeting, Sophie approached James. She was shaking. She tried to thank him, but she couldn't speak through her tears. James did something that 6 months earlier he would have never done. He put his hand on her shoulder and he said very simply, "No one should ever have to hide to eat. No one." In the days that followed, something amazing happened in the mansion. The atmosphere changed. It's hard to explain, but it's true. The house, which had always felt cold and formal, started to feel warm. People started to smile. People started to talk to each other. During the meals that they all now shared, conversation would happen. Real conversation. Not about work but about life. James found himself sitting at the table longer than he needed to. He would listen to stories from his staff. He learned that one of the gardeners had a son who wanted to be an artist. He learned that one of the cleaners was taking night classes to become a nurse. He learned that Margaret, the head housekeeper, had been married for 40 years to a man who was now ill with cancer. He learned all these things that he should have learned years ago. He learned that these people had lives. They had dreams. They had struggles and hopes and fears. For the first time in his life, James was really paying attention to other people. And it changed something inside him. A few weeks into this new arrangement, James called Sophie into his study. She was nervous. She thought maybe she had done something wrong. That's how used she was to expecting criticism and punishment. But James had something very different to show her. He handed her an envelope. Inside the envelope were documents. Official documents. James had created a scholarship fund for Sophie's brother. Full scholarship. Not just tuition but room and board, books, everything. He had also arranged for medical care for Sophie's mother. Not just basic care but good care. The kind of care that might actually make a difference. Sophie looked at these papers in complete disbelief. She couldn't process what she was reading. James told her very simply, "You have spent your life helping others. You have sacrificed for your family. Now let someone help you." "Let me help you," Sophie cried. She cried hard. And James understood that these were not tears of weakness. They were tears of relief. They were tears of someone who had been carrying a burden alone for so long that she couldn't believe anyone would help her put it down. From that day forward, everything changed for both James and Sophie. And I want to tell you that the changes weren't just about them. The changes spread out into the world like ripples in water, touching people they didn't even know. Sophie's mother, whose health had been declining for years due to lack of proper medical care, began to improve. She didn't become completely healthy overnight. That's not how real life works, but she got better. She got the medications she needed. She got the doctor's visits. She got the care that any human being deserves. And for the first time in years, she could actually enjoy her life a little bit instead of just surviving. Sophie's brother was able to go to school. Not just high school, he was already in high school, but he was able to focus on his studies instead of worrying about how his family would pay for food. He was able to think about his future. He was able to dream about what he wanted to do with his life. And Sophie herself began to transform. She started to smile. Not the kind of forced smile that she had worn while hiding in the corner, but a real smile. A smile that came from genuine happiness. She started to stand up straighter. She started to speak up during meals, sharing her own stories and thoughts. She started to become visible. But the transformation that happened inside James was perhaps even more profound. You see, James realized something during this time. He realized that his life, for all of his success and all of his money, had been empty. He had been looking for something his whole life, and he didn't even know what it was. He had thought that money would give it to him. He had thought that success would give it to him. He had thought that control and power would give it to him. But none of those things had filled the emptiness inside him. The emptiness had been filled when he chose to see another person. When he chose to help. When he chose to care. James started to spend less time in his office and more time with other people. He started to think about what else he could do with his wealth. Not to make more money but to help others. He started to visit orphanages. He started to visit community centers in poor neighborhoods. He started to see the world as it really is. A world where there are many people struggling, many people hiding like Sophie was hiding, many people going hungry. And James started to give. He gave anonymously at first. He would donate money to food programs. He would sponsor education programs for children in poor neighborhoods. He would pay for medical care for people he didn't even know. He never told anyone that it was him. He never looked for credit or praise. He just gave. One day, one of his business partners asked him, "James, what's happened to you? You used to be so focused on making money. Now you're giving it away. You're spending time away from your business. What's changed?" And James thought about that question. He thought about the answer. And then he told his friend something that the old James never would have said. "I thought wealth was about ownership. I thought it was about how much you could accumulate. But I was wrong. Wealth is really about what you can give without expecting anything back. Wealth is about being able to help people. That's the only thing that matters." His friend looked at him like he was crazy. And maybe from the perspective of the old James, he was crazy. But from the perspective of the new James, from the perspective of the man who had learned to feel again, it all made perfect sense. Months passed. And something beautiful happened in the mansion. The place that had once been cold and formal and perfect became warm and lived in and real. There was laughter. There were conversations. People brought their families to the house sometimes on their days off, and James welcomed them. He treated them like they belonged. Sophie started to help organize meals for the nearby community shelters. With James's permission and his financial support, she would take food that was prepared in the mansion's kitchen and distribute it to people who needed it. And for the first time, Sophie was using her gifts to help others, instead of just trying to survive herself. James would sometimes go with her to these shelters. He would help serve food. He would talk to the people there. And he learned things that he had never known before. He learned what it felt like to be hungry. He learned what it felt like to be homeless. He learned what it felt like to be invisible in a world that didn't care about you. He also learned something else. He learned that kindness is contagious. When you show kindness to one person, that person often wants to show kindness to another. The people who worked in James's house started to treat each other better. They started to care about each other. They started to form a community instead of just being a collection of employees. One of the gardeners, the man whose son wanted to be an artist, asked James if his son could study art in the mansion's guest house during the summer. James said yes immediately. Not as charity but as a genuine opportunity. He even provided art supplies and materials. By the end of the summer, the gardener's son had created beautiful paintings. One of them now hangs in James's study. The woman who was taking night classes to become a nurse finished her degree with James's financial support. She now volunteers at a clinic in the poor neighborhood near the mansion, providing free medical care to people who can't afford it. Every person she helps, she thinks about James. Every person she helps, she's grateful for the chance she was given. Margaret's husband, who was ill with cancer, received the best medical care available. His treatment was expensive, but James paid for it without hesitation. The man lived for another 2 years after James started helping. 2 years that Margaret got to spend with her husband. 2 extra years of memories. And Margaret tells everyone that James gave her the greatest gift she could have received. More time with the man she loved. One afternoon, almost a year after James first saw Sophie eating leftovers on the floor, something peaceful happened. It was a bright afternoon, the kind of afternoon where the sunlight is golden and warm. The sunlight was streaming through the tall windows of the dining room, and James sat at the long table with his staff. Everyone was there. Sophie, Margaret, the gardeners, the cleaners, the cooks, everyone. They were sharing a meal together, the way they did every evening now. There was food on the table. There was conversation. There was laughter. Sophie served the last dish, and then she sat down at the table with everyone else. She sat at a real chair. She used a real plate. She was no longer in the shadows. She was no longer hiding. She was visible. She was valued. She was worthy. As they all ate together, James looked around the table. He looked at the faces of all these people. He thought about how much his life had changed. A year ago, he wouldn't have been able to name half the people in this room. Now they were part of his life. They were important to him. They mattered to him. James felt something inside his chest. It was a feeling he didn't quite recognize at first. It took him a moment to understand what it was. It was peace. Not the peace that comes from having money. Not the peace that comes from being successful or powerful. It was the peace that comes from knowing that you've done something right. The peace that comes from feeling like your life actually means something. For the first time in years, maybe the first time in his entire life, James understood what it meant to be truly wealthy. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about possessions. It wasn't about power or status or control. It was about connections. It was about caring for other people. It was about making a difference in someone's life. He thought about Sophie. A year ago she was hungry. A year ago she was hiding. A year ago she thought the world didn't care about her. Now she was healthy. Now she was visible. Now she knew that she mattered. And James had given her that. But here's the thing, and this is important. Sophie had also given James something. She had given him back his humanity. She had reminded him what it felt like to care about another person. She had shown him that there was more to life than money and success. They were connected now, James and Sophie. Not as employer and employee, but as human beings who had helped each other find their way back to what really matters. As the meal continued, as everyone ate and talked and laughed together, James realized something else. He realized that Sophie wasn't the only person who had been hiding. He had been hiding too. He had been hiding behind his wealth and his success. He had been hiding from his own emotions, from his own humanity. He had built walls so high that he couldn't see over them. But Sophie had helped him climb back over those walls. She had shown him what was on the other side. And what was on the other side was beautiful. James thought about the future. He thought about all the things he wanted to do. He wanted to help more people. He wanted to create more programs. He wanted to use his wealth to make a real difference in the world. But most importantly, he wanted to remember. He wanted to remember this moment. He wanted to remember what it felt like to be truly happy. He wanted to remember that happiness doesn't come from what you have, but from what you give. If you're watching this right now, I want to ask you something. I want to ask you to think about the people in your life. Think about the people around you who might be struggling. Think about the people who might be hiding just like Sophie was hiding. Think about what you might be able to do to help them. Doesn't have to be big. It doesn't have to be expensive. Could be as simple as seeing someone. It could be as simple as asking how they're doing and really listening to the answer. Could be as simple as treating someone like they matter because they do. They really do. James's story reminds us of something very important. It reminds us that kindness is real. It reminds us that compassion is real. It reminds us that one person making one choice can change the world. Not the whole world maybe, but the world of the person they're helping. And sometimes that person goes on to help others. And the ripples just keep spreading. So thank you for listening to this story. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story touched your heart, if it made you think about kindness and compassion and what it means to truly be wealthy, please like this video. Please share it with someone you care about. Please subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next story. 'Cause we need more stories like this. We need to be reminded that humanity is worth fighting for. We need to be reminded that kindness matters. We need to be reminded that we can change the world, starting right where we are, starting with the people right in front of us. In the end, James learned that compassion is the real currency of a meaningful life. Not money, not success. Compassion. The willingness to see another person. The willingness to care. The willingness to help. That's what makes a life meaningful. That's what makes a life rich. That's what makes a life worth living. Thank you, friends. I'll see you in the next story.